We used to have acres of land, a beautiful old farmhouse, and the promise of a simple, fulfilling life. But one spring, everything changed when we brought home a scarecrow from a local flea market. It started out as a harmless addition to our farm, but it soon became clear that this scarecrow was anything but ordinary. The scarecrow was unlike any I had seen before. It was tall, with a tattered hat and a burlap face stitched into a grotesque smile. Its eyes were made of old buttons, and its clothes were faded and worn. Despite its eerie appearance, I thought it added a rustic charm to our field, so I placed it in the center of our cornfield to ward off pests. Spring was in full bloom, and our farm was buzzing with activity. The fields were vibrant with crops, the air filled with the sounds of nature, and the sun was beautiful. My wife Ella and our 2 kids, Hannah and Luca, loved spending time outdoors, tending to the animals and playing games. First, everything seemed normal. The scarecrow stood watch over the fields, and our days were filled with the usual routines of farm life. But soon, strange things began to happen. It started with the animals. Our chickens, normally content and clucking, became agitated, clucking frantically and avoiding the cornfield. Our cows, usually docile, started acting skittish and restless. One morning, I found one of our goats dead near the scarecrow, its body twisted in an unnatural position. I was puzzled and disturbed, but chalked it up to a predator attack. However, as the days passed, more animals fell ill or died under mysterious circumstances. The scarecrow seemed to be at the center of it all. Our family spent the evening cooking dinner together, helping the kids with their homework and watching TV, but the sense of unease grew stronger with each passing day. At night, I would catch glimpses of the scarecrow from the kitchen window, its button eyes seemingly fixed on our house. One evening, as we were watching TV, Luca pointed out the window. "Dad?" "The scarecrow moved," he said, his voice trembling. I looked outside, and sure enough, the scarecrow seemed to have shifted positions. I tried to reassure Luca, telling him it was just the wind, but my own heart was racing. After the kids went to bed, Ella and I talked about what we should do. She suggested getting rid of the scarecrow, but I hesitated. It was just a scarecrow after all. What harm could it do? That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt colder, and the shadows seemed to dance in the corners of my vision. I got up and looked out the window, and my blood ran cold. The scarecrow was now closer to the house, standing at the edge of the cornfield. The next morning I decided to move the scarecrow back to its original spot. As I approached it, a chill ran down my spine. The air around it felt different, heavier, and the smell of decay was strong. I grabbed the scarecrow and dragged it back to the center of the field, feeling its button eyes on me the entire time. As the day went on, the sense of dread only grew. Ella and I took the kids out, hoping to distract ourselves. We played frisbee, ate sandwiches, and tried to enjoy the beautiful weather, but the joy felt forced, the laughter hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, as we were putting the kids to bed, Hannah mentioned having nightmares about the scarecrow. She described it moving around the farm, coming closer to the house at night. Ella and I exchanged worried glances, but reassured her it was just a dream. I decided to set up a camera to watch the scarecrow overnight. I positioned it in a window with a clear view of the field and the scarecrow. As the night wore on, the house creaked and groaned. The wind howled, and sleep was elusive. I found myself constantly checking the camera feed. At around 3 a.m. I saw it. The scarecrow moved. It didn't just sway in the wind, it shifted its position, its head turning slowly towards the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it take a step forward, its burlap face frozen in that grotesque smile. The next morning I showed the footage to Ella. She was horrified, and we both agreed that the scarecrow had to go. We decided to burn it, hoping to break whatever curse it seemed to carry. We took it to a clearing at the edge of our property, doused it in gasoline, and set it alight. The flames consumed the scarecrow, and for a moment we felt a sense of relief. But as the fire burned, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The smoke curled into strange shapes, and the air around us felt charged with electricity. When the fire finally died down, only ashes remained, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, we all slept more soundly, but the peace was short-lived. The next day, we found strange symbols carved into the ground where the scarecrow had stood. Our animals continued to act strangely, and the whispers returned with a vengeance. It was as if the curse had not been broken, but had intensified. However, in the weeks that followed, the sense of dread slowly dissipated. Our animals returned to their normal behavior, and the strange occurrences ceased. The scarecrow was gone, but the memory of its cursed presence remained etched in our minds. If you ever come across an old eerie scarecrow, think twice before bringing it home. Sometimes, what seems like a harmless addition to your home can invite unimaginable horror into your life. When Mia and I bought our old farmhouse in New England, we were captivated by its rustic charm. The barn, in particular, fascinated me. It was a majestic structure with weathered wood, towering high against the backdrop of our expansive fields. I never expected that our beloved barn would soon become the center of a terrifying ordeal. The barn stood proud and tall, with red paint that had faded to a deep rustic hue over the years. Inside, the barn was filled with relics of the past, rusty tools, ancient machinery, and stacks of hay. The smell of aged wood and straw permeated the air, creating a nostalgic atmosphere. Mia and I dedicated our weekends to restoring the barn. It was hard work, but we loved every minute of it. The barn's character shone through as we cleaned and repaired it, and we often imagined the events it had witnessed over the decades. It was a labor of love, and we took pride in our progress. One evening, after a long day of work, I was putting away some tools when I noticed something peculiar. A faint, charred beam hidden behind a pile of old crates. It seemed out of place in the otherwise well-preserved structure. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I touched the beam, the wood cool and rough under my fingers. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house felt different, heavier. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just fatigue. Mia and I had dinner, watched a movie, and went to bed, but sleep eluded me. I kept hearing faint whispers, like distant voices carried on the wind. The next day, I decided to clear out the old crates to get a better look at the charred beam. As I worked, I found more signs of fire damage, scorched wood, melted metal, and blackened nails. It was unsettling, but I pushed the thought aside and continued with my chores. In the evenings, Mia and I would relax on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze and the sounds of nature. We talked about our plans for the farm, our hopes and dreams. It was during one of these quiet moments that I first saw it, a fleeting shadow moving inside the barn. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the shadow was gone. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. I would hear footsteps in the barn, and the whispering voices grew louder. Mia noticed my distraction and asked if everything was okay. I didn't want to worry her, so I brushed it off, saying I was just tired from the work. One night, I decided to check the barn before bed. The air was cool and still, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the fields. As I approached the barn, I saw movement inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped through the doors, the wooden planks creaking under my weight, but the barn was empty. Mia and I tried to maintain our routine, hoping the strange occurrences would pass. We had picnics in the fields, played board games in the evenings, and enjoyed each other's company, but the sense of unease never left, and the barn's shadow seemed to grow longer each day. One afternoon, while we were watching a movie, the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into darkness, and a cold draft swept through the room. Mia and I grabbed flashlights and candles, trying to make light of the situation, but then we started hearing the whispers, louder than ever. The nights became unbearable. The whispering voices filled the house, and I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I felt a constant sense of dread, as if something was watching us, waiting. Mia grew worried, noticing the bags under my eyes and my jumpiness. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a loud crash from the barn. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The whispering was louder than ever, a cacophony of voices calling out. I grabbed a flashlight, gathered all my courage, and headed outside. The barn loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the interior. The air was frigid, and my breath formed clouds in the cold. As I moved deeper into the barn, I saw them, figures, faint and ghostly, moving among the shadows. They were transparent, their faces contorted in expressions of fear and anguish. My flashlight flickered, and the figures disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. I retreated to the house, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what I had seen, and the fear gnawed at me. Mia tried to comfort me, but the sense of dread remained. The barn was no longer a place of pride, but a source of terror. Days turned into weeks, and the haunting continued. The whispering voices never ceased, the shadows never stayed still, and the figures appeared more frequently. I felt trapped, unable to escape the presence that had taken hold of our lives. Mia and I grew distant, the strain of the haunting taking its toll on our relationship. We argued more often, both of us on edge and sleep-deprived. One night, as we sat in the living room in silence, we heard it. A child's laughter, clear and innocent, coming from the barn. We looked at each other, fear in our eyes, and I knew we couldn't go on like this. I didn't know what to do, but I knew we had to find a way to end the torment. The barn's haunting remains a mystery. We never discovered the full story behind the charred beam or the ghostly figures. The voices and shadows became a part of our lives, but one thing we knew, we wouldn't lose our farm just because it was haunted. The idea of living on a farm and the sense of being connected to the land all appealed to me. When my wife and I found a beautiful old farmhouse in the mountains, we thought we had found our dream home. But what we didn't know was that it came with a dark past and a ghostly presence. The farmhouse was charming, with its weathered wood siding and wraparound porch. It sat on a vast expanse of land, surrounded by rolling hills and dense woods. The previous owner, an old farmer named Henry, had vanished without a trace a few years before. The property had been abandoned since then, left to the elements. We moved in during the fall, when the leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. The crisp air and the smell of earth filled our senses as we unpacked and settled into our new home. It was perfect, or so we thought. At first, everything was idyllic. We spent our days exploring the property, fixing up the house, and enjoying the tranquility of rural life. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, strange things began to happen. It started with small disturbances. We heard footsteps on the porch at night, but when we checked, there was no one there. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the house settling or animals outside. One evening, while I was chopping wood, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing old-fashioned overalls. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, and I hurried back to the house. That night, as my wife and I cooked dinner, I told her about the man I had seen. She laughed it off, suggesting it was probably a neighbor curious about the new owners. We ate dinner, played a board game, and went to bed, trying to forget about the eerie encounter. But the disturbances continued. We would wake up to find the barn door open, even though we were sure we had closed it. The livestock seemed agitated, often staring into the distance as if they could see something we couldn't. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and the figure appeared more frequently, always at the edge of the forest, never coming closer. One night, I woke up to the sound of muffled voices. It was coming from the barn. I grabbed a flashlight and crept outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The barn was dark and silent, but I could feel a presence inside. I shone the flashlight around, illuminating the old wooden beams and the hay-strewn floor. Suddenly, I saw him, the man from the forest, standing in the shadows. I called out, demanding to know who he was and what he wanted. He stepped forward into the light, and I could see his face. It was gaunt with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. "This is my land," he whispered, his voice hollow and echoing. "You don't belong here." I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. When I looked up again, he was gone. I ran back to the house, locking the door behind me. My wife woke up, alarmed by my frantic state. I told her what had happened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely scared. We tried to carry on with our lives, but the fear lingered and the disturbances intensified. The figure appeared closer to the house, and the whispering voices grew louder. One evening, as I was feeding the animals, I found an old leather-bound journal hidden in the barn. It belonged to Henry, the previous owner. The entries detailed his life on the farm and his growing desperation to keep it running. He wrote about making a pact with a dark entity, offering his soul in exchange for bountiful harvests and prosperity. The last entries were frantic and incoherent, describing visions of shadows and the feeling of being watched. My blood ran cold as I realized that Henry's disappearance was linked to the pact. The entity he had bargained with had come to collect its due, and now it was haunting us, trying to drive us away from the land it claimed. The nights grew more oppressive. We would hear knocking on the walls, footsteps in the hallways, and voices calling our names. The figure would appear at our windows, staring in with those empty eyes. Sleep became impossible, and the farm we had once loved turned into a prison of fear. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I decided enough was enough. I walked out to the barn. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The barn door creaked open, and I stepped inside, my heart racing. The figure was there, standing in the center of the barn. I held up the journal, shouting that I knew about the pact and that we wanted no part of it. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder and the shadows deepened. The whispering voices surrounded me, filling my head with their sinister chorus. Suddenly the figure lunged at me. I stumbled back, dropping the journal. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I felt a cold hand grasp my arm and I screamed, tearing myself free and running back to the house. We packed our things that night and left the farm. We couldn't stay there any longer, not with the phantom farmer haunting our every moment. We sold the property, disclosing its haunted history to the new owners, who were paranormal investigators looking for their next project. Farming is in my blood. My family has owned our farm in the Midwest for generations, and I've always loved the simple, honest life it provides. But last summer something changed. It started with the cornfield, a place that was a source of pride and sustenance. By the end, it had become a place of nightmares. It was late June, and the corn was growing tall, vibrant and green. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, rows upon rows of sturdy stalks swaying gently in the summer breeze. There was something almost hypnotic about the sight, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the rich, dark soil. One evening, as the sun was setting, I walked through the field, enjoying the coolness of the air and the rustling of the corn. I'd done this countless times before, using the time to clear my mind and plan the next day's work. But that night, something felt different. The air was thick and heavy, and the usual sounds of the evening, the chirping of crickets, the distant calls of birds, were absent. At first I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to fatigue, but as I walked deeper into the field, I noticed something odd. The rows of corn seemed to be growing in unusual patterns, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. I stopped and stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was as if the field had been disturbed, but there were no signs of human activity, no tracks, no broken stalks, nothing. A chill ran down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the house. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves but more deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced as I scanned the field, but there was no one there. I bolted for the house. What could be causing that, and what were those noises? Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my chores, but that night remained in my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overworked and stressed. But strange things kept happening. Tools would go missing, and at night, I would hear the whispering again, always just on the edge of my hearing, like a half-remembered dream. One afternoon, I decided to take a break and do something normal, something grounding. I invited my neighbors over for a barbecue, hoping the company would dispel the eerie feeling that had settled over the farm. We laughed, cooked burgers, and played horseshoes. It was a welcome distraction, but even in the midst of laughter, I felt a persistent unease, as if we were being watched. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky darkened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cornfield loomed in the background, its edges now shrouded in shadow. After everyone left, I decided to confront my fear head-on. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the field, determined to find the source of the disturbances. The beam of light illuminated the tall stalks that swayed in the night breeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I ventured deeper, the whispering growing louder with each step. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the field. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure was draped in tattered clothes, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. It stood perfectly still, but the whispering seemed to emanate from it, growing louder and more frantic. I called out, my voice trembling, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. I took a step closer, my flashlight flickering. Suddenly the figure moved, turning its head to face me. The hat fell away, revealing a skull, empty eye sockets staring back at me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. I ran, tripping over the roots and stalks, the voices following me, echoing in my mind. I burst out of the field, gasping for breath. I entered my house and slammed the door behind me, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I locked the doors and windows, trying to block out the voices, but they persisted. That night, I barely slept. The voices invaded my dreams, turning them into nightmares. I saw the figure standing at the edge of the field, watching me with its empty eye sockets. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, demanding something I couldn't understand. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I went online, searching for any information about the land. I discovered that the farm was built on what had once been Native American land, a place of sacred rituals and burials. The cornfield, in particular, had been a site of significance where ceremonies had been performed to honor the dead. I realized that I had unknowingly disturbed something ancient and powerful. The disturbances in the cornfield were a warning, the whispers, a plea for recognition and respect. I knew I had to do something to make amends. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in Native American culture. She agreed to visit the farm and help me perform a ceremony to honor the spirits. Together, we set up an altar at the edge of the cornfield, offering gifts of tobacco and cornmeal, and recited prayers to acknowledge the land's history and the spirits that resided there. As we finished the ceremony, the air seemed to lighten, and the whispering stopped. The sense of dread that had hung over the farm lifted, replaced by a feeling of peace. I thanked the historian, grateful for her help and understanding. Over the following weeks, the disturbances ceased. The cornfield returned to its normal state, the rows straight and orderly. The tools stayed where they were supposed to be, and the whispering voices were gone. But I never forgot the lesson I had learned. The farm was more than just land. It was a place with a deep and complex history, a history that demanded respect. I realized that the eerie events had been a reminder of the past, a call to honor the memories of those who had come before. The cornfield had shown me the importance of understanding and respecting the land and its history. It taught me that some disturbances are more than just random occurrences. They are messages from the past, asking to be acknowledged. Working as a cashier at the local supermarket, you get to know the regulars, exchange small talk with strangers, and sometimes laugh with co-workers during the slow shifts. It was simple work and for the most part uneventful. That's probably why I liked it. Nothing too out of the ordinary ever happened. I never thought I'd dread going into work at a place as ordinary as a supermarket, but after what happened, every shift started to feel like a countdown to the next unsettling encounter. It started like any other day. I just clocked in for the afternoon shift, the sun still shining through the big front windows of the store. It was one of those slow weekdays where the most exciting part of my shift was waiting for the dinner rush. I'd been working at this store for over a year, so I knew the rhythm of the place. Morning regulars came in for their newspapers and coffee. The lunch rush brought a crowd, and then things would slow down until people stopped in on their way home from work to pick up last-minute groceries. It was predictable, comforting even. I settled into my usual checkout lane, exchanging pleasantries with customers and scanning items with a mechanical efficiency. Everything was normal until I saw him. He wasn't exactly memorable at first, a man in his late 40s. He came through my line with just a few items, a loaf of bread, a six-pack of beer, and some chips. When he handed me his money, his fingers brushed mine, lingering just a bit too long. It was enough to make me uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off. People are awkward sometimes, no big deal. But then he looked at me, really looked at me, with this intensity. His eyes were locked on mine. "Have a nice day," I said, even though the interaction had left me on edge. He didn't say anything, just gave me this weird smile before grabbing his bag and walking away. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The man came back the next day and the day after that. At first I didn't think much of it. We had plenty of regulars, and I figured he was just one of them. But then he started showing up every day, always in my line, even when others were shorter, and always with that same unsettling stare. He didn't say much at first, just handed me his money and walked away. But there was something about the way he looked at me, like he was watching me more closely than he should. His eyes would linger on my face, and sometimes I could feel him watching me, even after he'd already left the checkout. My co-workers didn't seem to notice, and I didn't bring it up. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that maybe I was overreacting, but it was hard to shake the growing unease that crept up every time I saw him walk into the store. Then the comments started. "Your hair looks nice today," he said one afternoon as he handed me his payment. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my tone light, even though his comment made me even more uncomfortable. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, like he was cataloging every detail about me. From then on, every time he came through my line, there was a new comment. "Pretty eyes. Nice smile. You're here every day, aren't you?" His words always hung in the air long after he left, and I started dreading the sound of the door chime every time a customer walked in, afraid it would be him again. It was like this invisible weight pressing down on me every shift, a creeping anxiety that made my skin prickle. When I wasn't working, I tried to push it out of my mind. I spent time with my friends, watched movies, did normal things, but every time I walked into work, that sense of unease returned. It felt like something was building, like the situation was teetering on the edge of something worse. I didn't know what that worse was, but I could feel it coming. One evening, when the store was nearly empty and I was halfway through my shift, he came in again. This time, he didn't grab any groceries. He just walked straight up to my checkout lane, that same weird smile on his face. "Are you single?" he asked. My first instinct was to lie, to say I had a boyfriend, but my throat was too dry to speak. I managed to force a laugh instead, trying to keep things light. "I don't really talk about personal stuff at work," I said, hoping it would end the conversation, but it didn't. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "What time do you get off work?" The question sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind raced, scrambling for an answer that wouldn't give him what he wanted, but wouldn't antagonize him either. I didn't want to make him angry. I didn't want to escalate the situation. "Late," I mumbled, trying to sound casual. "I work late." He didn't say anything after that, just gave me another one of those smiles, turned, and walked out the door. Was he going to wait for me? Was he planning something? The rest of my shift dragged on in a blur, my eyes constantly flicking toward the front doors, as if expecting to see him waiting for me. Every minute felt like an hour, and by the time my shift ended, I was practically shaking with anxiety. As I clocked out and grabbed my bag from the back room, I tried to convince myself that it would be fine. I'd walk to my car, get home, and everything would be okay. But when I stepped outside, the night air felt too still, too quiet. I spotted him immediately. He was standing near the edge of the parking lot, half hidden behind a row of cars, watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks, frozen with fear. What was he doing? Why was he still here? I panicked, and for a second I didn't know what to do. My car was only a few rows away, but the thought of walking past him, of getting anywhere near him, was too much for me. I fumbled for my phone and dialed my manager's number. "He's here," I whispered. "The guy, he's still here." Within moments, my manager was outside, his face stern as he marched toward me. "I'll walk you to your car," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, my legs feeling like jelly as we made our way across the parking lot. The man was still there, his eyes following me the entire time, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching. When we reached my car, I could finally breathe again. I thanked my manager, climbed inside, locked the doors, and I drove away. I didn't see him again after that. For weeks I went to work every day, always on edge, always scanning the parking lot, the aisles, the checkout lines, waiting for him to come back. But he never did. Part of me was relieved, part of me was terrified, because even though he never came back, the memory of the way he stood in the parking lot has never left me. I still feel like he's out there waiting for the right moment, and that's the worst part. That evening, I was at the local supermarket picking up a few things for dinner. It wasn't anything special. I needed pasta, tomatoes, some fresh bread, easy stuff. The store was pretty quiet by that time, mostly just a few people browsing the aisles. I had no idea that I wouldn't be able to shake the encounter that would follow me home. The supermarket was one of those mid-sized chains with aisles that always seem too narrow. You know, the kind where every footstep echoes a little too loudly. I grabbed a basket and wandered through the produce section, picking out a few tomatoes, a cucumber, and some lettuce. I liked these late-night grocery trips because they were calming, almost meditative. As I made my way toward the bread aisle, I noticed him, an older man, maybe in his early 70s. He had the kind of face that made it hard to guess his age, lined with wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone who looked so weathered. I caught his eye as I passed, giving him a light nod. I grabbed a loaf of sourdough and tossed it into my basket. I wasn't one to overthink things. I continued my shopping, moving to the pasta aisle next. As I stood there, debating between two different brands of spaghetti, I heard a soft chuckle behind me. I turned and saw him again, the same man from the bread aisle. He was standing just a few feet away, his cart empty, his eyes fixed on me with a frozen smile plastered across his face. "Pasta, huh?" he said, his voice raspy. "Good choice." I forced a polite smile, though my heart had started to race. "Yeah," I replied. "Easy dinner." He nodded, that strange smile never faltering, his eyes still locked on mine. It was like he wasn't just making small talk, like he was trying to latch onto something deeper. His gaze felt invasive, like he was looking past my eyes and into my mind, reading every thought I tried to hide. "Do you cook a lot?" he asked, taking a slow step toward me. "Sometimes," I muttered quickly, grabbing the pasta and tossing it into my basket. I didn't want to seem rude, but I was suddenly very aware of how empty the aisle was, how isolated I felt. "Well, I'm sure you're a great cook," he said. "You seem like someone who knows what they're doing." That comment made me pause. There was something about the way he said it, like he knew me, like he'd been watching me for a long time. I looked down at my watch, pretending I was in a hurry, hoping it would give me an excuse to leave. "Well, I should finish up," I said quickly, offering him a strange smile before turning my back to him. I moved to the next aisle, still feeling tense. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just an old man trying to make conversation, but there was something about his presence that set my nerves on edge. I grabbed the rest of the things I needed as quickly as possible, but he was nowhere to be found. And for a brief moment, I let out a sigh of relief. I headed toward the checkout lanes, my basket full and my mind focused on getting home. The store felt emptier than before, the aisles stretching out like long, narrow corridors of silence. As I placed my items on the conveyor belt, I looked around, scanning for any sign of the man. Nothing. Maybe he had left. Maybe I'd overreacted. The cashier rang up my items, and I paid without any more thoughts of the old man. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. The weird feeling in my gut was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But as I walked out into the parking lot, I saw him again. He was standing by the entrance, leaning against the wall, that same frozen smile still on his face. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my hands clench around the handles of my grocery bags. He didn't say anything, just stood there. I kept my head down and walked toward my car. I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. My car was parked near the far end of the lot, and with every step I took, the parking lot seemed to stretch farther and farther. As I fumbled with my keys, I couldn't help but look back. He was still standing there, still watching, that smile never fading. But now there was something darker in his eyes, something that made my skin crawl. I got into my car, locked the doors, and pulled out of the lot. I didn't want to see him watching me. I didn't want to know if he had moved. As I drove home, the tension in my chest began to ease. When I got home, I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and tried to shake off the lingering fear. I told myself I was safe now. He was just some strange man. I would never see him again. But as I sat down on the couch, the groceries still sitting untouched in the kitchen, my phone buzzed. I looked down. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You made it home safely. Good. I knew you would." I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. How did he know? How did he get my number? Before I could react, another message appeared. "I told you. You seem like someone who knows what they're doing." My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I blocked the number, deleted the texts, and tried to calm myself down. But the fear was too strong, too real. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every little noise in the house and the wind outside set my nerves on edge, my mind racing with images of that man and his frozen smile. I never saw him again after that night, but I'll never forget those texts, the ones that made me realize he had been watching me, following me. I still wonder how he got my number, and I still wonder if one day I'll look up in the supermarket and see that frozen smile staring back at me. Because somehow I know he's not done with me yet. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys striking up small talk with strangers, whether it's in line at the bank, waiting for coffee, or grocery shopping. I guess I've always thought of myself as friendly, someone who could chat about nothing and not worry about it turning into something sinister. That changed the night I met him. I've always been the kind of person who prefers shopping late at night. I enjoy the quiet, the lack of crowds, and the ability to move through the aisles at my own pace without bumping into anyone. There's something calming about a nearly empty supermarket, but it was during one of those quiet nights that I experienced something I'll never forget. It was a Wednesday, around 10:30 p.m., and I had just realized I was low on groceries. It had been a long day at work, and I wasn't in the mood to cook, but I needed a few things for the rest of the week. I thought I'd pop over to the local supermarket, grab what I needed, and be back home in less than an hour. It was a plan I'd followed countless times before. The store was about 10 minutes from my apartment, in one of those quieter parts of town where things close early and the streets empty out by dusk. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed only a handful of cars scattered around, mostly near the front entrance. I liked it that way. Fewer people meant I could get in and out quickly. I parked, grabbed my reusable bags, and made my way inside. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The store was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the occasional squeak of a shopping cart breaking the silence. I grabbed a cart and started my usual routine. Produce first, then dairy, meats, and snacks. I always move through the store the same way. There's something comforting about routines, especially when you're tired. It was the same cart, the same aisles, the same mindless process. But as I turned down the snack aisle, something caught my eye. There was a man leaning against his cart. He was tall, with disheveled clothes and a scruffy beard, his hair sticking out in all directions as though he hadn't bothered to comb it. He was muttering to himself, his lips moving rapidly, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. His eyes were wide, darting around the aisles as if he were looking for something or someone. I hesitated for a moment. There was something off about the way he looked at me, something almost predatory, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I quickly grabbed what I needed and moved to the next aisle, shaking off the strange encounter. People talk to themselves all the time. I told myself he was probably just eccentric or maybe having a bad day. But as I continued through the store, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, fearing he might be following me. I made my way to the dairy section, standing in front of the rows of milk and yogurt, when I heard it again, that same low muttering. I turned, and when I looked, he was standing at the end of the aisle again, staring at me with that same intense gaze, his lips still moving, though no sound came out. This time the store was almost empty, just me, the man, and a cashier up front who seemed oblivious to everything happening in the aisles. I tried to ignore him, pretending to focus on the expiration dates of the milk in front of me, but I could feel his eyes on me, and that started to worry me. I grabbed the closest carton of milk and hurried to the next aisle. I told myself it was nothing. He was just a weird guy, that's all. But my hands were shaking as I tossed the milk into my cart. I tried to distract myself by checking off the remaining items on my list, bread, lunch meat, eggs, but no matter where I went, I kept seeing him. Every time I turned into a new aisle, he was there, standing at the opposite end, watching me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I didn't know what to do, but the more I moved through the store, the more I realized he was following me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked around the store, but there was no one else in sight. The cashier was too far away, probably scrolling through her phone, unaware of what was happening. I felt trapped. I made a beeline for the self-checkout machines, my cart rattling as I moved as fast as I could without breaking into a full-on run. I could feel my skin prickling with anxiety as I scanned my items, my eyes darting around the store, searching for any sign of the man. For a moment I thought I'd lost him, but as I looked up, there he was, standing just beyond the checkout area, his eyes still locked on me. his mouth moving in that same rapid, silent muttering. I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. My hands shook as I swiped my card, praying the machine would move faster. I kept looking at him out of the corner of my eye, my stomach twisting in knots. Finally, the machine beeped, signaling that my transaction was complete. I grabbed my bags and bolted for the door. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a brief moment of relief wash over me. The parking lot was empty. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. I turned, and there he was, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his eyes still fixed on me. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. The silence between us was heavy and suffocating. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. I quickly unlocked the door and threw my bags into the passenger seat. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, but after a few frantic tries, the engine started. I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires screeching as I sped down the empty road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing him still standing there watching me was too much. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to calm myself down. I couldn't shake the image of him. His wide, unblinking eyes, the way he had followed me through the store, his lips moving in that silent muttering, and I had no idea who he was or what he wanted. Now every time I hear the sound of footsteps behind me, I feel my heart stop for a second, because you never know when you might run into someone like him. I always saw grocery shopping as just another routine task. It's one of those everyday things that we all do on autopilot. Grab a cart, weave through aisles, toss the usual items in, and get out as quickly as possible. Nothing about it ever struck me as dangerous or unsettling. In fact, I kind of enjoyed the mindless routine of it. At least, I used to. Now every time I step into a store, I get this sinking sensation, like there's something lurking just beyond my line of sight. Because that's where it started. Just an ordinary trip to the supermarket. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just finished my shift at work. I figured I'd swing by the grocery store on my way home, grab some things for dinner, maybe a bottle of wine to relax with later. The store was one of those big chains, clean, well lit, usually crowded with families, nothing unusual. I pulled into the parking lot, grabbed a cart from the line outside and walked in. The cold blast of the AC hit me as I stepped through the automatic doors, and I remember feeling a small sense of relief at the familiar low murmur of shoppers. It felt normal, safe. I started in the produce section, absent-mindedly tossing apples, some leafy greens, and a bag of baby carrots into my cart. As I reached for a bag of oranges, I noticed someone standing at the far end of the aisle, a man, late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a dark jacket that seemed a little out of place for the warm weather outside. He wasn't looking at the fruit. He was looking at me. I felt a twinge of discomfort, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just spaced out or thinking about something else. I moved on to the next aisle, mentally checking things off my shopping list as I went. About 10 minutes later, I found myself in the snack aisle grabbing a bag of chips when I noticed him again, the same man. He was standing at the end of the aisle, his cart empty, watching me. He wasn't pretending to browse or looking at anything else. He was just there. I thought it was a bit odd, but I tried to ignore it. People cross paths in grocery stores all the time. It's not unusual to see the same person more than once, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, silent, set off alarm bells in my head. I pushed my cart down the aisle, trying not to let my imagination run wild. Maybe he just happened to need something from the same section. Maybe he wasn't paying attention to me at all. But even as I turned the corner into the next aisle, there was an odd vibe in the air that I couldn't ignore. I moved quickly through the store, grabbing the last few things I needed as fast as I could. I wasn't in the mood to linger anymore. The cozy familiarity of the store had started to feel suffocating. I felt like I was being watched. By the time I reached the dairy section, my cart was nearly full and I was ready to check out. That's when I saw him again. He was standing at the far end of the aisle, just staring at me. This time, I couldn't brush it off. He wasn't browsing. He wasn't shopping. His cart was still empty. I tried to make sense of it, tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but every time I moved, he moved. Every time I turned a corner, he was there. He never got close, just close enough to make his presence known, close enough to make me feel like I couldn't breathe. I felt stupid. This was a public place full of people. Nothing bad could happen here, right? It's a grocery store. You're safe in a grocery store. I tried to calm myself down, yet whenever I looked around, I noticed him in the distance, his expression never changing, just the same cold stare. It was the way he looked at me, like I wasn't even a person, just something to watch, something to follow. I looked around at the other shoppers, hoping someone would notice, would see what was happening and step in, but no one paid any attention. They were all lost in their own little worlds, pushing their carts and comparing prices, completely unaware of the growing panic tightening in my chest. I thought about leaving, just abandoning my cart and getting out of there, but a weird sense of pride, or maybe just stubbornness, kept me rooted to the spot. I didn't want to overreact. I made my way to the checkout lanes, my hands shaky as I loaded my items onto the conveyor belt. For the first time in what felt like hours, I didn't see him. The cashier rang up my items, and I forced a smile, trying to act normal. My hands were still trembling as I reached for my wallet, fumbling with my credit card. "You all right, ma'am?" the cashier asked. I opened my mouth to say something, to explain what had been happening, but the words wouldn't come. I felt stupid again, embarrassed. What was I supposed to say? Some guys following me around the store. What if I was wrong? What if it was all in my head? "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, giving her a tight-lipped smile as I grabbed my bags and turned to leave. I saw him again. This time he was standing near the entrance, leaning against the wall, just watching. I felt my stomach lurch as nausea washed over me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned back to the cashier, my voice shaky as I whispered, "Can you get someone? I think that man is following me." Her eyes widened, and she immediately called over a manager. Within minutes, a store employee, big, burly, and with a no-nonsense look on his face, approached me. I pointed toward the man at the entrance, my voice barely a whisper as I explained what had been happening. The employee nodded and made his way over to the man, who, upon seeing him approach, quickly turned and walked out of the store. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He just left, like nothing had happened. I stood there, watching as the automatic doors slid shut behind him. I didn't feel any relief, though. The whole thing left me cold, like something was unfinished. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be waiting outside, lingering in the parking lot, or that I'd see him again somewhere else. The store employee came back a few minutes later, his face serious but calm. "He's gone," he said. "I watched him drive off. Do you need someone to walk you to your car?" I nodded, grateful but still shaken. As we made our way across the lot, I kept looking around, expecting the man to appear again, to be hiding behind one of the cars, standing in the shadows, waiting for me. But he wasn't there. I drove home that night, every muscle in my body tense. I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, convinced that I'd see his car trailing behind me, following me home. But there was nothing. No one. I never saw him again, but the memory of that day still haunts me. I think about it every time I walk into a store, every time I feel a pair of eyes on me when I'm in public. Maybe he was just some creep looking to make someone uncomfortable, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. To this day, the mundane task of grocery shopping feels loaded with tension. I don't linger in the aisles anymore. I don't wander the store casually like I used to. I move quickly, keeping my head down, my eyes scanning for anything or anyone that feels off. Because I've learned that even in the most ordinary places, you're never really safe.